Matthew, thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for attending today. I know it is cliche, but I hope you believe me when I say what an honor it is to appear at a Hillsdale College forum. This Kirby Center is just a magnificent facility, and I just believe the work of Hillsdale College is indispensable to the cause of liberty in America. I can't tell you how many different years I have always looked forward to receiving my copy of Imprimis. There's nothing else quite like it out there, but I am very much delighted to be invited to speak to you today. As I look around the audience, some of you I haven't seen since the summer. I hope you have had a good summer. Personally, we had a rather momentous summer in the Hensarling family. I think it was July when my wife called me and said, it is time to have a serious discussion about getting a pet for the children. So I engaged in what I thought was a serious discussion with my wife, saying, okay, we live in Dallas, I work in Washington, you're a carpool mom, do we really need another mouth to feed? Surely there's other ways we can make our children happy. So it was about a week later, I get a call from the wife, okay, we're at the pet shelter, do you want a cat or a dog? Yes, freedom of choice. So I said, okay, well, I lost round one. We have a covered porch. We could put the doghouse there, large backyard. The dog could run around. With apologies to all the cat people in the audience, I'm not really a cat person. They scratch all the furniture. I really don't want to pay for that. If we're going to get a pet, let's get a dog. Okay, well, we're just looking today. So next thing I know, I'm literally in the midst of a hearing. And believe it or not, occasionally I will look at my BlackBerry during a hearing. And next thing I know, I open an attachment from my wife. There is a picture of a cat. I text her back and say, please tell me that is not our cat. To which she texts back, his name is Grayson, isn't he cute? So anyway, I finally get home back to Dallas, and we have this discussion, and I say, okay, Melissa, we talked about the pet I lost there. We talked about the dog I clearly lost there. I'm not feeling too good about all this. And she said, yeah, as a Republican member of Congress in Washington, surely you've grown accustomed to speaking and having your views ignored. So anyway, freedom to choose. You are free to ignore what I have to say today. I hope you choose not to ignore what I have to say today. And now I think I have gotten the frivolity out of my system. To say that one thing we can't ignore are the very ominous and daily headlines that we read today about very ominous foreign threats to our safety and our security that emanate from faraway capitals, from places like Moscow, Damascus, Tripoli, and Tehran. And as real and serious as these foreign threats are, we must not lose sight of the domestic threats to our freedom and our prosperity that emanate from another capital much closer to home, and that is the capital we find ourselves in today, Washington, D.C. Now, some of the domestic threats may appear less evident in the short term, but over time they are corrosive to our Constitution and inimical to our well-being and our prosperity. None of us can ever lose sight of James Madison's famous observation that, quote, there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment by those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations. Today I want to speak about one such threat. It is a threat that has grown markedly worse over the last 6 years, but I still believe it receives far too little attention. And that is the threat which is posed by the rise of what some have termed the fourth branch of government, namely omnipotent, ubiquitous agency government, which I believe has clearly made us less prosperous, less entrepreneurial, less optimistic, and a less free society. Today, a record number of Americans, more than 46 million of our fellow countrymen, find themselves dependent on food stamps. Median household income is down by more than $2,000 in real terms since January of 2009. And working Americans are obviously having to pay more at the pump and more at the grocery store. The so-called Obama non-recovery recovery is now officially the slowest, weakest in the last 70 years. One of the reasons that we are a less prosperous society is because we are a less entrepreneurial society. America is less entrepreneurial now than at any point in the last 3 decades, according to a recent report of the Brookings Institution. New business startups are again at their lowest level in 30 years. The Brookings authors of the study went on to say that if the decline in entrepreneurship continues, America will suffer, quote, a continuation of slow growth for the indefinite future. Less prosperity and a depressed entrepreneurial spirit has also made us a less optimistic people. Americans increasingly believe that our best days are behind us. According to the most recent Wall Street Journal NBC News poll, 71% believe our country is headed in the wrong direction. 60% believe the U.S. is in a state of decline. And profoundly, when asked if life for our children's generation will be better than it has been for us, 76% say do not have such confidence. Sadly, that is an all-time high. In a Washington Post column recently with the depressing headline, quote, Americans' optimism is dying, one commentator took a deep dive into the poll results and found that the lack of confidence cuts across every economic status, every gender, every race, every age, and every ideology. It touches all of us. Among our fellow citizens is Monica Alexander, an African-American single mom who's one of the nearly 8 million Americans today who have not found a full-time job and have to settle for part-time work. Quote, it's been a struggle to keep food in the house, to keep gas in the car, she says. Her son asked her, Mom, do we really have to live like this? Or Dominic Fennell, for 15 years, Dominic earned a 6-figure salary for his family as a book illustrator, but for the past 4 years, he's only been able to find part-time jobs. I'm panicking, he says. All I think about is looking for work. Americans' growing lack of faith in the future is disturbing, and it is fundamentally un-American in the sense that it is so out of character for us as a people. And it corresponds not only to our current economic hard times, but to the perceptible loss of freedom in America today. Indeed, the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom records a loss of freedom here during every single year of the Obama administration. Heritage attributes our erosion of freedom to the loss of property rights, a decline in the rule of law, and the substantial growth in the size and scope of the federal government. Americans are beginning to take note. A Pew Research poll last year found for the first time a majority of the public says that the federal government threatens their personal rights and their freedoms. Perhaps, as my 10-year-old might say, ding, 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 they got it right. It's not lost on them that Washington now decides what their children's teachers can teach, what kind of light bulbs they're allowed to buy, what credit cards they can put in their wallet, or whether they can even choose their own doctor. Ladies and gentlemen, I think perhaps the very first step in regaining our prosperity is to appreciate the critical role that entrepreneurship has played in our history and in economic growth. Now, while researching this subject, I was pleased to discover that Hillsdale had already done much of the work for me when they published Arthur John Steele Gordon's speech on the very same subject in Imprimis earlier this year. Parenthetically, one more reason you should always read Imprimis. Anyway, we should all recall collectively that colonists came to America not just for religious liberty and not just for political liberty, but they came for economic liberty as well. Several of the colonies, as Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Virginia, were founded not by the crown, but by profit-seeking corporations. Others, including Pennsylvania and Maryland, were founded by proprietors. And profit was the primary reason the Dutch founded New York and settled in Manhattan. Indeed, Gordon said in his Hillsdale remarks, quote, so bent on making money were the Dutch that they did not get around to building a church for 17 years, worshiping instead at the fort. This entrepreneurial drive helps explain why the 13 colonies were the richest place on earth on a per capita basis by the time we declared our independence. So from the earliest beginnings of the Republic, we have always been a land of the entrepreneur, the dreamer, and the risk taker, and yes, that includes the risk of failure. Someone who clearly understood this was Steve Jobs, the famous co-founder of Apple. In an interview before he died, Jobs said, quote, "I look at myself as sort of a trapeze artist." The reporter asked him, "With or without a net?" Jobs replied, "Without." Because Steve Jobs was a risk taker, Apple became one of the most valuable companies in the world whose innovations continue to revolutionize our lives. Another entrepreneurial risk taker is Robin Chase, the co-founder of Zipcar, the largest car-sharing company in the world. When she launched Zipcar in 2000, she was left with $78 in her bank account. It was preposterous, a ridiculous thing to do, she said, but it worked. Zipcar became a quintessential business success, and 13 years later, the company sold to Avis for $500 million. But what's so important about the story of these two entrepreneurs is not the amount of money they were able to make for themselves. It was about the ability to build successful companies and to pursue happiness. Their God-given right to pursue happiness. And because they did, millions of other people were able to enjoy products and have jobs and put a roof over their head. But it's not just the famous entrepreneurs. It's the small business entrepreneurs in every single small city and village and burg around America. Small business people like Rick Carmona, who lives in the 5th District of Texas that I have the privilege to represent in Congress. It was over 30 years ago that Rick started his own Mexican food restaurant, Carmona's. If you're ever in Terrell, Texas, I highly recommend it to you. His mother was the cook when they first started, and for several years, Rick did everything else. He said, quote, "We didn't make much money for a long time, but I never gave up. I just kept working at it." But folks, something is changing in America today. Fewer and fewer people are deciding to do what Rick did. People are giving up. They're no longer working at it, to use the words of my small businessman in East Texas. The spirit of free enterprise, of entrepreneurial risk-taking, and dream chasing that has defined us as a people, regrettably, seems to be fading away. Robert Samuelson of the Washington Post wrote a recent column headline, "Where have all the entrepreneurs gone?" After analyzing Brookings Institute data, he wrote that the U.S. economy is increasingly dominated by older firms rather than new startups. And this is a phenomenon that is quite unusual in our nation's history, and it is a trend that can be seen in every state and industrial sector in our nation. Fewer entrepreneurs taking fewer risks leads to fewer jobs. It is that simple. So what's causing this disturbing lack of entrepreneurial risk-taking in America? Economists at the University of Maryland and the Census Bureau have written, quote, "The cumulative effect of regulations is a prime suspect and discriminates against new businesses by favoring established firms that have the experience and resources to deal with it." Listen to the words of Bernie Marcus, co-founder of Home Depot, quote, "Having built a small business into a big one, I can tell you that today, the impediments that the government imposes are impossible to deal with. Home Depot would never have succeeded if we tried to start it today. Every day you see rules and regulations from a group of Washington bureaucrats who know nothing about running a business. And I mean every day. It's become stifling." Last year, a page one story in the Wall Street Journal declared, quote, "A risk-adverse culture had infected our economy and was harming U.S. workers." The story generated a lot of discussion among the newspaper's readers. Many responded with their own personal stories and views. One reader wrote, quote, "Government has expanded exponentially, creating self-sustaining bureaucracies that busy themselves with rules and regulations imposed on essentially the private sector, putting the bar higher at every turn, exhausting entrepreneurs' energies and meaningless formalities, and bleeding them with ever-increasing social burdens." Now, I don't need to read a newspaper to hear this angst and this anxiety. I hear it every day. in the 5th Congressional District of Texas. Typical is what I heard from a small business person, also from Terrell, Texas, named Hal. He said, Jeb, the greatest risk I worry about is that someday my business will be destroyed by OSHA, EPA, IRS, or the Department of Labor. It's not an exaggeration. The reason so many small business folks worry about these risks is that most of us know we cannot defend ourselves. A business that is rightfully or wrongfully the target of one of these agencies is completely outgunned in terms of resources, he told me. And I'll never forget the day that a businessman at a small cabinetry shop in Palestine, Texas, he came up to me to discuss closing his business. He said, Congressman, it got to the point in dealing with all the federal regulations, it just got to the point where I thought my federal government didn't want me to succeed. The business closed, a dozen or more people lost their jobs. So while the American people are being told repeatedly that nothing is getting done in Washington, entrepreneurs and small businesses all across our land know differently. They know better than anyone that the federal bureaucracy is busier than ever. Last year, Washington set a new record by issuing final rules consuming 26,417 pages in the Federal Register. Not one of them voted on by Congress. Another 3,305 regulations are moving through the pipeline at the historic rate of roughly one new regulation every 2 hours, 24/7, 365. Whether it's the 20-plus pages needed to define what a retail pet store is, to rules concerning the interstate movement of Charwil avocados, to the thousands of pages comprising the federal takeover of our healthcare system, every Washington regulation has an impact on our struggling economy. Every Washington regulation impacts the ability of some needy American to get a job. And let's also remind ourselves, regrettably, many of these regulations are written to protect established businesses from future competition. One study estimates the overall financial cost of regulatory compliance and its economic impact has now reached almost $2 trillion annually, which translates into an annual hit of approximately $15,000 to household budgets and more than $10,000 per employee to small business budgets. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not recall ever in my lifetime where the challenges of upward mobility and economic opportunity for low and moderate income Americans have been greater. Not surprisingly, I also do not ever recall in my lifetime when the bureaucratic, regulatory, red tape burdens on our entrepreneurs, our risk takers, our small businesses have been greater as well. The evidence is overwhelming. There is a clear, causal, direct link between the two. And as costly in financial terms as this regulatory onslaught is, the true cost has to be measured otherwise. And it's not even measured in the harm to the entrepreneurial spirit. No, the true cost of the rise of agency government is far more profound: the loss of personal freedom. Is what many term the fourth branch of government has risen. Due process, checks and balances, and separation of powers, all cornerstones of our political liberties, have waned. Now, the rise of the fourth branch of government is not a new phenomenon in any respect. As heritage scholar Robert Moffat notes, it began in the early 20th century when progressives became disillusioned with our Constitution. They believed that its purpose of securing individual rights through limited government and its structure of separated powers could no longer meet the needs of a modern world. And in short term, they advocated for the application of what they called a new science, and they pushed for creation of bureaus to be staffed by nonpartisan social scientists armed with massive amounts of data and procedures for eradicating all of society's perceived ills. Herbert Crowley, who was a leading progressive voice in the Wilson era, noted that new agency government, quote, exercises an authority which is in part legislative and in part judicial. It is simply a convenient means of consolidating the divided activities of government to certain practical social purposes. Madison in Federalist 47 had a very different take. He wrote, quote, "The combination of all power, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." The seed of this form of tyranny was planted during the Wilson administration, bloomed during FDR's New Deal, became overgrown in LBJ's Great Society, and has now reached crisis proportions under President Obama. Our chief executive, who possesses both pen and phone, but regrettably lacks a copy of the Constitution. This century-long progressive expansion of government has unleashed the modern regulatory state as we know it. Extremely powerful, extremely intrusive, terribly opaque, bafflingly bureaucratic, distinctively undemocratic, and alarmingly unaccountable. As we all know, Article 1, Section 1 of our Constitution states, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. In a Congress. Thus, when Congress delegates its fundamental legislative authority to unelected, unaccountable bureaucracy, it is arguably acted in an unconstitutional manner. And as it does, the people's right to both self-government and due process is undermined. The citizens' right to carefully deliberate proposed legislation through representatives in Congress becomes reduced to nothing more than a mere notice and comment period. A period when citizens are permitted to lodge complaints and suggestions, all of which the unelected bureaucrats are free to ignore, and all of which the unelected bureaucrats may use to retaliate. In Federalist 52, Madison wrote, "The definition of the right of suffrage is very justly regarded as a fundamental article of Republican government." But who elected the legions of bureaucrats who now have become legislator, cop on the beat, prosecutor, judge, jury, and often compensated victim, all rolled into one? The public even rarely knows their names. Today, Americans are less and less governed by the rule of law and more governed by the discretion of regulators. It is OSHA now, not Congress, that governs our workplace safety. It is the EPA now, not Congress, that governs over our air quality. It is HHS now, not Congress, that governs over our health care. And most alarmingly, to our economic opportunity and economic liberty, it is now the bureaucratic progeny of Dodd-Frank that rules over our financial markets. Jonathan Macy of the Yale Law School was most prescient when he noted that, quote, "Laws classically provide people with the rules. Dodd-Frank is not directed at people. It is an outline directed at bureaucrats and instructs them to make still more regulations and to create more bureaucracies." Specifically, after weighing in at over 2,000 pages, Dodd-Frank demands 400 new mandates be promulgated and multiple new agencies be spawned. Two of the most worrisome of these agencies are the Orwellian-named Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, otherwise known as the CFPB, and the Financial Stability Oversight Council, known as FSOC. Both operate largely out of public view, both are subject to virtually no checks and balances, and both have been granted sweeping unilateral powers to fundamentally control huge swaths of the American economy. Arguably, CFPB is the single most powerful and least accountable federal agency in our republic's history. It clearly operates outside our constitutional system of checks and balances. CFPB, or more specifically, its one unelected director, has almost absolute discretionary power to find any consumer product, quote-unquote, abusive, and thus fundamentally outlaw it. So when it comes to our credit cards, our auto loans, our mortgages of us and our fellow citizens, the CFPB has unbridled power not only to make them less available and more expensive, but to absolutely take them away. And in so doing, the CFPB is fundamentally unaccountable to the president because its director can only be removed for cause. It is fundamentally unaccountable to Congress because the CFPB's funding is not subject to appropriations. The CFPB is fundamentally unaccountable to the courts because Dodd-Frank requires courts to grant the CFPB deference regarding its interpretation of federal consumer financial law. Thus, CFPB is regrettably unaccountable to the American people, one of the classic hallmarks of agency government. All of us are familiar with the axiom that absolute power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Such is the case at the CFPB, which is why there are newspaper stories with headlines like, quote, "Bureaucrats gone wild," "CFPB is rife with discrimination," employees say, and "CFPB's renovation costs skyrocket to $216 million. Inspector General sees no basis for it." Additionally, the CFPB is engaged in one of the most sweeping data collections of personal private financial records our nation has ever seen. It is an effort that I assure you rivals the data collection of the NSA. But regrettably, there's no one at the CFPB who can be voted out of office. There is no one at the CFPB to be held accountable. Now let's take a quick look at FSOC. FSOC is an amalgamation of regulators heading agencies that either helped cause the financial crisis or were largely negligent in preventing it, notwithstanding they had the regulatory power to do so. Dodd-Frank rewards their failures by granting them the most sweeping powers over our capital markets since the New Deal. Dodd-Frank allows federal regulators to unilaterally define vague statutory terms like systemic risk, financial stress, and financial stability, and by so doing allows FSOC to dictate capital standards, product mix, lending activities of major financial firms throughout the U.S. economy. They are even empowered to break them up. As AEI scholar Peter Wallison summarized, the FSOC's authority is in effect a blank check to consign to federal regulation any large firm the government wants to regulate. Ladies and gentlemen, this is nothing short of a functional occupation of our economy by federal regulators who are now empowered to do central planning. All of this is being done outside of public view. With the exception of agencies dealing in classified information relating to national security, FSOC may very well be the nation's least transparent federal entity. The public cannot view their proceedings because 2/3 of them are conducted in private executive sessions. Better Markets, a Washington organization that consistently advocates for more regulation of our financial system, said, FSOC's proceedings make the Politburo look open by comparison. No one in America even knows who they are. At the few open meetings they have, they snap their fingers and it's over, and they're all scripted. They treat their information as if it were state secrets. It's obvious that those who drafted Dodd-Frank fear risk-taking and innovation. But as a society, if we trade freedom for safety in the long run, we get neither, and we are less prosperous in the offing. The raison d'etre of Dodd-Frank was the risk of the shadow banking system, yet a far greater danger to our freedom and prosperity is posed by the shadow regulatory system. As University of Chicago professor Jerome Rajan wrote in his book Fault Lines, we have to recognize that the only true safe financial system is a system that does not take risk, that does not finance innovation or growth, that does not help draw people out of poverty, and that gives consumers little choice. And yes, that's exactly what we see in America today. As Washington tries to regulate risk out of existence, there is less innovation, less growth, more poverty. That's our America. So, ladies and gentlemen, our nation faces a great challenge. But we have faced great challenges before. And I am optimistic about the future of America, and you should be as well. I know it is cliche to say that it is darkest before the dawn, but what an opportunity we have before us, because rarely in our lifetimes have the failures of big government liberalism been more evident than they are today. What an opportunity before us. So what we need today, more than in any time in the last generation, is a return to our country to its first principles of personal liberty and limited government. What we need today, using the title of Hillsdale's Matthew Spaulding's bestseller, is for us to loudly and proudly proclaim, yes, we still hold these truths to be self-evident. A return to first principles. First, Congress must reaffirm the primacy of congressional authority in Article 1 of the Constitution. Congress must end the practice of delegating lawmaking authority to unelected, unaccountable agency government. No more passing vague laws that direct agencies to fill in the blanks with specifics according to their discretion. The REINS Act, which has passed the House, would introduce both constitutionality and accountability into the system by requiring Congress, not the bureaucracy, but Congress to approve all major new regulations. The act is simple, the act is profound, the act is revolutionary, and its ultimate passage into law must be a major priority of the conservative movement. Secondly, members of Congress must take back from the fourth branch of government the power of the purse, granted in Sections 8 and 9 of Article 1 of the Constitution. If you grab a bureaucracy by its budget, its heart and mind very well will soon follow. Thirdly, Congress must rediscover and reinvigorate the 10th Amendment in order to reinstitute federalism, one of the cornerstones of our constitutional system. As most here are familiar, Madison wrote in Federalist 45, "The powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in state governments are numerous and indefinite." Finally, we must celebrate the role of risk-taking as an American right, as an American heritage, and as an American destiny. We must educate our fellow citizens that when we entrust government agencies to manage our risk, we risk losing both our freedom and our prosperity. Now, all this will require strong and dedicated, consistent, cheerful leadership in Washington and in every great capital and county seat across America. Everyone has a role to play. No one can be a passive observer. As for me, I intend not just to participate, I intend to lead. But at the end of the day, the future of our great people does not rest in my hands, and it certainly does not rest in the hands of the United States Congress. I'm reminded of Jefferson's message to Madison: "The people are the only sure reliance for the preservation of liberty." And that's the true reason I'm optimistic. Because the American people are anxious, but they're not hopeless. They may have lost faith in Washington, but they have not lost faith in America. And with the help of institutions like Hillsdale College, they never will, and we will soon get our republic back. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hensarling. That was a wonderful talk, laying out an argument about what is going on and what to do about it, precisely what we'd like to encourage here. We have some time for some questions and have some discussion with the Congressman before he has to go back. Sir.
Congressman, I'd be very interested in what you would see as steps 1, 2, and 3, assuming that we get a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican President in 2016.
Well, I like your assumption. Having said that, I stand before you as the son and grandson of chicken farmers, so I don't quite count my chickens before they hatch. But we still dream big dreams in America. I'm running for re-election in the 5th District of Texas. I hope I get an opportunity to continue to be chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, so they're not going to elect me Senate Majority Leader. But I would, to answer your question, make it a very high priority in order to rein in agency government, the passage of the REINS Act. I think that would be incredibly important. Many of you know I have also labored tirelessly along with my dear friend and our great champion of our cause, Paul Ryan, to try to take America off the road to bankruptcy. As Paul has put it, probably the most foreseeable crisis in America's history. Ultimately, in order to do that, you're going to have to promote fundamental economic growth and you're going to have to reform current entitlement programs for future generations. So that bespeaks of a tax code that is fairer, flatter, simpler, more competitive, and hopefully IRS free. And it speaks of the premium support system that Paul Ryan has authored and championed is our entitlement reform. So that's two of the three anyway, right there. Now, quite realistically, I think in divided government that our chances to advance the cause of freedom and prosperity is probably going to be worked through our appropriations system with what are known as appropriations riders. I don't spend a whole lot of quality time with our president, but I'm having a hard time believing he's going to have some kind of epiphany in the last 2 years of his administration and regret all the different ways that he has made us poor and less free. Reclaiming the power of the purse is critical to reclaiming our country, and so I'm not exactly sure what S3 would be, but it might be some kind of an appropriations bills that begins to take us in the step in the right direction.
I think if the objective, the larger objective is to pull back delegated power into Congress again, then there'll be many measures that will require more legislative aggressiveness, if you will, that would demand a president that would be agreeable to allowing that to play out. You want to have a normal legislative process and regain that control. Isn't that the central objective?
It is the central objective. I would say I don't recall a time where so much power has been yielded from we, the people, to their government, and then from Article 1 to Article 2, and then frankly from Article 2 to the non-existent fourth branch of government. So, and frankly, both parties have been guilty. When Republicans had the White House, there was a piling on, hey, it's our guy in the White House, let's go give him some of our legislative power. But again, the separation of powers is one of the cornerstones of our liberty. And so, one, reinstituting Congress as a co-equal branch of government, and I think as we know, I think there's a reason the founders made it Article 1, but to at least reassert that primacy is critical.
I have a question for you about the short-term reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank and the continuing resolution.
You weren't enthralled by my speech, huh? Okay.
I loved it. I thought it was great. You really led the fight against reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank, so I'm wondering...
I hope I'm still leading it.
Still leading, excuse me. Do you see this as a victory for conservatives, first and foremost? And secondly, have you gotten any reassurance from leadership that this will be the last reauthorization of the bank before June?
Well, I do not confuse motion with progress, and I do not confuse progress with victory. So I view an opportunity to decouple the expiration date of the Export-Import Bank, to decouple that from the expiration of a continuing resolution to be progress. I believe the fate of the Export-Import Bank, it should stand or fall on its own. So I'm not enamored of this particular continuing resolution. If I had my druthers, this would not be what would be before me, but I learned very early on in my congressional career, I don't get to vote on what I want to vote on. I have to vote on what's in front of me. And so I intend to support it, assuming it comes to the floor. I do not believe that XM should be part of the CR. I regret that our Republican conference is putting it there. But I do think that for those of us who believe that although this agency is small in scope, it is incredibly important in principle and direction, that members ought to have an opportunity to understand the issue, debate the issue, and again, have XM stand or fall under its own weight, and ultimately this CR will serve that purpose. So it's not the first time I've swallowed hard in my congressional career.
Sure, it's Jeff Barrett. And there's an organization in town called the Madison Coalition, which is proposing another approach to this agency government problem, and that is that a state-based, state-run, using Article 5 constitutional amendment that would be initiated by the states, which would say that if 25% of the any House of Congress, or if 25% of the states were objected to a particular regulation, that they could force Congress to actually vote on that regulation and actually do their job. Now, this would be an end run around Congress and the President, because it would be started from the states using their Article 5 power in the Constitution. Now, you would obviously need a lot of states, but if the REINS Act is not passed, this might be one way around it. And I'm just wondering what you might think of that idea, because it's just another focus of power to try to get this thing solved.
Well, I haven't studied the idea carefully, but again, I take the threat of the rise of unelected, unaccountable agency government very seriously. So I would want to explore all means possible to rein it in, to preserve our liberty and our prosperity. But any constitutional amendment, as you know, is heavy, heavy lifting. When I was speaking to the other gentleman about S1, S2, and S3, I talked about a flat tax. My personal policy preference, for example, would be the fair tax, but unless you repeal the 16th Amendment, I fear you would end up like Europe, end up with both. So as a more practical matter, I'm kind of a flat tax guy in the real world. I have to take the world as I find it, not always as I want it to be. So certainly explore the idea and what states need to do to reinvigorate the 10th Amendment. As we say in my neck of the woods, God bless Texas and God bless the rest of them as well.
I think we have time for one last question. You keep your questions short, so I know what you're asked.
Sounds like you've already been challenged.
And I think you may have heard a similar question at the Cato Institute last fall. In 1971, the U.S. abandoned its obligation under the Bretton Woods Agreement to provide redeemability to foreign governments in gold of U.S. currency they accumulated. And since then, we've been able to inflate our currency infinitely because it's backed by the petrodollar, which we enforce militarily. The founders very much, Andrew Jackson, when he ended the Second Bank of the U.S., said that a circulating money of gold and silver coin was intended to prevent the wealth of the laboring class from being inflated away by the corporations working with the politicians and the financiers, serving corporatism, which it's the corporatism that's creating the regulations that empower the central planning. So doesn't it all go back to following the money, like we learned in Watergate? And don't we need to restore a constitutional system of money and also a new Bretton Woods Agreement to be fair with other nations?
My, how the time has flown. Serious subject, deep subject. One, I'm not in a position to address with the seriousness that it deserves at the moment. Listen, we have a number of challenges with a fiat currency, which our nation has had for quite some time. And our Financial Services Committee is continuing a lot of work as part of our Federal Reserve Centennial Oversight Project. Can't completely tell you where the project is headed and will ultimately end. We have done our first piece of legislation, one of many to follow. So dealing with sound money is a very important issue. Not prepared to go into it in detail today. I must admit there's 1,000 ways to advance the cause of freedom and opportunity, and on any given day, I may be able to work on 2 or 3. Not quite working on that issue today, which is not to say it is not important, and I hope it will receive greater attention should I remain chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. on the challenges, again, to our economy that is posed by our current fiat system of currency. Anyway, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for very fine remarks, very thoughtful remarks about our current situation, some of your thoughts about how to get out of that. I appreciate that. I would like to, before you run off, as you do, I want to thank you for your service on behalf of Hillsdale College. We're very thankful for that and the work you're doing to direct the country, work with statesmen. You're always welcome at Hillsdale, here and on the main campus, so I have a Hillsdale tie for you.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
I think it'll work.